Hello and welcome to this free 1-hour guitar music theory masterclass. Due to popular demand, I combined the 12 most important theory concepts I shared on this channel so far into one awesome course style video. These are the exact 12 theory topics that allowed me to score composition jobs that got me 2 gold awards for my soundtrack work in Austria, studio work for multiple certified platinum albums so far, and professional touring jobs all across the globe. What I want to say with this is that I promise that taking in all this information today will get you great results as well, for sure. You can easily access each individual chapter with the timestamps in the description of this video down below, and you can also find the Patreon links to each individual lesson down there as well. As a member of our awesome Patreon community, you can download the video play-alongs, backing tracks, tabs and guitar profiles for all of the exercises in this video, and that's the fastest and easiest way of finally understanding all of this, finally filling those annoying and sometimes embarrassing holes in your knowledge. So let's start at the beginning right now and gradually move to more and more advanced topics. Have fun. So as a guitar player, what could be the first skill you have to work on before you can even get into music theory? It's learning all the notes on the fretboard. First of all, you will never really be able to communicate with other musicians and other instrumentalists because you can't always refer to the notes you're playing like, I'm playing on the 4th fret on the 3rd string. A piano or saxophone player won't really understand what you're talking about. So here's the exercise I recommend to start out with when it comes to note location. It's called the octave triangle. As you could see with this exercise, we're taking advantage of the octave interval, and the way it is spread out over the different strings resembles a triangle, hence the name octave triangle. So in the beginning you could just learn the notes on the low E string, for example just the white keys. So that would be E, the open low E string, F, G, A, B, C, D. First grade muses that all the rest of the notes are repeated in the next octave starting from the 12th fret, and then you can just fill in the notes in between. For example, the note between F and G could either be F raise the semitone, so F sharp, or G lower the semitone, so G flat. And then after you're able to visualize the notes on one string, you could start working with the octave triangle exercise that I showed you in this video. As you could see with the second repetition, I wasn't just playing single notes anymore, I was playing fragments of the A minor scale. So I can also use this knowledge and moving shapes in octaves with scale fragments or with arpeggios, so that is really useful for the future. So if you're not comfortable yet with finding all the notes across the fretboard, I'd recommend to do that for 5 to 10 minutes every day before you start your practice session. Just start out with a couple of note location exercises. So for this lesson I recorded 2 practical examples once again for you. In the first one I'm playing all the basic intervals across the neck, choosing one root note, A, on the 5th fret of the low E string, and the intervals are increasing in size over time, meaning that the distance between the 2 pitches gets bigger and bigger. For the second practical example, I made sure to write a riff once again to demonstrate a more practical approach of how you can use your knowledge about intervals in your own music. The only basic information you need to know before we get started is that an interval describes the distance between 2 different pitches. So for the first example, where I'm demonstrating all the different intervals, I'm essentially playing 2 notes at the same time, and the name of the interval describes the distance between them and the sound of each interval. So I really hope that I could demonstrate how the correct use of intervals can spice up your riffs with the second example. Everything was just based around the note A here on the 5th fret of the low E string, And actually the bass track was just playing A all the time in different rhythmic variations depending on what the drums were doing. So the intervals were doing all the hard work, establishing a interesting harmonic context and making that riff cool. So let's go through each interval once again a bit slower, and I will explain a couple of things about each one so you can memorize them a bit easier. First we start out with the perfect unison, the least interesting interval. As you can see, I'm just playing A on the 5th fret of the low E string, so we have the exact same pitch here. Up next it gets much more interesting with the very dissonant minor 2nd interval. As you can see, I have to do quite some stretching here. I'm playing A on the 5th fret of the low E string, as for all the intervals. This is my harmonic center. And I'm playing A sharp or B flat on the 1st fret of the A string. So this is the absolute smallest interval we can play concerning the distance of these two pitches. Up next we have the major 2nd interval. So first the minor 2nd, then the major 2nd, since the interval is getting a bit bigger now. Up next we have the minor 3rd, A and C here. This interval is basically responsible for the sound of minor chords. Major 3rd. So once again it's minor 2nd, major 2nd, minor 3rd, major 3rd. So I hope that you start to see a pattern right here. Up next we have the very underrated perfect 4th. So A and D. This one is sometimes used in metal riffs and has a really cool sound. Up next we have the really evil and cool sound of the diminished 5th or augmented 4th. So there are two names for this interval. It depends if the 4th is raised in a music theory context or the 5th is lowered. And as you can probably hear already, you can find this one in tons of metal or rock riffs where dissonance is required. Up next we have the absolute classic, the perfect 5th, often used as the power chord. Next we have the minor 6th and major 6th. A beginner's guide to understanding and memorizing these two intervals could be connecting them to the minor and major 3rd, for example, because the minor 6th has a sound and color quite similar to the minor 3rd, while the major 6th has a similar sound and color to the major 3rd. And in the end, after the minor 6th and major 6th, we of course have the minor 7th and major 7th. They are mostly used in minor chords to make them minor 7th chords, or in major chords to make them major 7th chords. Chord construction, and that refers to understanding how chords are actually built. Because in the beginning we are usually just studying chord shapes with chord diagrams, just learning where to put our fingers, but we don't really think about the notes we are playing in the chord and about their harmonic function and relation. You will only make significant progress with learning and really understanding complex and unique sounding chord shapes by analyzing the relation that the notes are in. So in the beginning, instead of just memorizing where to put your fingers with those basic major and minor shapes, I would suggest to locate and name the notes you're actually playing with those chords and to study the intervals that you're playing. For example, a super basic major chord like C major right here consists of the root, major 3rd and perfect 5th, and C minor would consist of the root, minor 3rd and perfect 5th. So by just comparing the basic structure of major and minor chords that way, I realized that I only have to change one note with those voicings. When I change the major 3rd in the major chord to a minor 3rd, I get a minor chord. So this is a skill that surprisingly a lot of rock and metal guitar players don't really have, since they are used to stacking riffs together and not really thinking about composing in a certain key. And for me that always kind of stood in the way of fully understanding music theory, of writing interesting and melodic guitar solos over my riffs. And then as soon as I understood basic cadences and what kind of key I'm actually playing and composing in, things got much easier. So if you want to get started working on that, my personal suggestion would be just writing down the natural major scale, for example. Let's pick C major. Maybe you're familiar with the notes of this very popular scale already. C, D, E, F, G, A, B. So now if I want to know which chords I have available to work with in the key of C major, I just have to stack the 3rd and fifth to all of those notes in the scale by only using notes that I can find within the scale. A super basic way of learning to understand it in the beginning is just counting up 3 notes to get the third for every note in the scale and 5 notes to get the fifth for every note in the scale. So let's say I'd like to find out what kind of chord I have on the first scale degree in the C major scale. I would just count up 3 notes, so 1, C, 2, D, 3, E. So the third for the chord on the first scale degree would be E, and then I'm counting up 5 notes to get the fifth for the first chord on the first scale degree. So 1, C, 2, D, 3, E, 4, F, and 5, G. And since that is a major third and a perfect fifth, that would be a C major chord. So unsurprisingly, I have a C major chord on the first scale degree or on the tonic of C major. That is a great exercise for you in the beginning, really writing down every single note in the scale and then adding the third and the fifth, only using the notes in the scale and then seeing what kind of chords you come up with. And of course, you can consult the internet and then check if you're right or wrong. Just like with chords, I was just thinking in those diagrams, boxes and shapes in the beginning, and I wasn't really thinking about the notes that I was playing. I was just memorizing the root note of each scale so I can move it around in different keys. And the biggest problem with that is that I was just mechanically learning all those scales, like the modes for example. But once again, I had no idea how to actually use that sound and where the characteristic notes are actually located in that scale that make this sound so special. So the way I personally recommend learning about scales is once again visualizing the notes and the intervals that you're playing. For example, just starting out with the natural major and minor scale. And the great thing is that for a lot of different scales, much more exotic sounding scales, you just have to change minor details in the natural major or minor scale to get there. So that was my biggest misconception when it comes to scales. I thought you have to learn millions of scales, you have to learn a new scale every single day. But the truth is, once you mastered the natural major and minor scale all across the neck and you can really visualize the notes, you just have to change minor details in those 2 reference scales, so to say, to get more interesting sounds. So to get started with the topic of scales, here are a couple of really cool shred guitar scales that I want you to learn. You can also find more lessons, more exercises, more video play-alongs, more tabs and more guitar profiles on all of that on my Patreon page, patreon.com/BERNTH. Over there you can already find over 100 lessons on guitar technique and theory, and I keep adding at least 1 lesson every single week. So if you still feel kind of lost with all of those topics, or if you just want to improve one of these very special topics right now, make sure to check out the individual lessons I recorded on these topics already. With today's lesson, I want to introduce you to an amazing and very helpful system that will give you a quick and super effective overview of your scales and arpeggios across the entire neck. For today's exercise and practical example, I picked one of the most common keys in rock and metal music, the key of E minor. We will only stick to this one basic shape for the E minor chord right here, starting on the 7th fret of the A string. And we will build the basic minor arpeggio, the minor 7th arpeggio and the E minor scale step by step. As always, you can download the PDF tabs, guitar profiles and practice backing tracks for this exercise on my Patreon page, patreon.com/BERNTH. As you could hopefully see with my note overlay graphics, everything was based on this basic E minor chord shape. Those were the notes in red. You probably know this basic voicing already. We're starting out with the root E on the 7th fret on the A string. Then we're playing B on the 9th fret on the D string, the perfect 5th. Then we're playing E once again, so the octave. Then we're moving to G on the 8th fret on the B string, that's the minor 3rd. And we're playing B once again on the 7th fret on the E string. The first thing you can do instead of learning huge arpeggio shapes all over the neck is just extending this basic chord that you already know a little bit to get the E minor arpeggio shape. As you might already know, we have the same notes in the E minor chord than we have in the E minor arpeggio. So instead of playing a chord, we see them as single notes similar to a scale. So in order to get my first basic arpeggio shape for this chord, I just stick to this position, to this section on the fretboard, but then I try my best to find the notes E, G and B, the root, minor third and fifth, in more positions on the neck here, sticking to a maximum of 2 notes per string, so we only want 1 or 2 notes per string to form this arpeggio. So first of all, I can visualize that I have B here on the 7th fret on the low E string, so I'm adding it to the arpeggio. I'm starting out with B, the perfect fifth, then I'm playing E, the root, then I can see that I have G right here, so I can add it as well, so that's the beginning of my arpeggio. Then I'm sticking to the basic minor chord shape. I'm playing B once again, E, G and B once again here on top of the arpeggio. So once again, I'm just visualizing this basic chord that I already know right here on the fretboard, and I'm extending it with the notes that I'm actually playing already in the chord, E, G and B, the root, minor third and perfect fifth, but I'm adding them in different positions on the neck to get a full arpeggio shape. The next step to move to more interesting phrases harmonically is adding the minor seventh. That way we get an E minor seventh arpeggio, and we actually don't have to change anything about what we just learned, we just have to add one more note. So the minor seventh of E is the note D. So I'm just adding D in all the positions I see fit to build my E minor 7th arpeggio. So when I visualize that, I'm starting out with B, and then I can already add D with a hammer on the 10th fret of the low E string. So I get a symmetrical pattern on the E and A string, which is always nice. Then I'm moving to B once again, the perfect fifth on the 9th fret on the D string. And then I get another chance to add the minor 7th right here on the 7th fret on the G string. I'm playing D right here before I'm hammering on to E once again. So up to this point. So I'm not changing anything about the previous arpeggio, I'm just adding D in 2 positions so far. And then I'm adding G on the 8th fret on the B string once again, the minor third, before going to B and one last time up to D, the minor 7th here on the 10th fret of the high E string. So the full arpeggio sounds something like that. Which sounds pretty nice. The next step would actually be the pentatonic scale, since we only have 5 notes in that one, so we only have to work with 1 more note. But in our case I want to go straight for the 3 note per string position of the E minor scale, since we talk about shred guitar playing a lot. So if you also want to include some cool shred phrases in your solo, this is the shape you want to go for. And when I'm playing this scale phrase right here, I'm still visualizing the E minor chord right here, and I'm basing this scale phrase on this position. What I mean by that essentially is that I can break out of this chord in an improvised context, for example, and play a arpeggio phrase like I demonstrated with the previous example, or I could go into a scale phrase. I can just visualize all that when I'm playing the E minor chord shape right here. So this is the biggest takeaway from this lesson and the first step to really mastering the fretboard. Now here's a short but very fun practical demonstration. This is a lick that I came up with by working with this system. You can also find the tabs and guitar profiles of this lick on my Patreon page, patreon.com/BERNTH, in case you want to learn it. How do you play better and more professional sounding guitar solos? How do you finally stop playing the same ideas and licks over and over again? How do you come up with interesting and exciting ideas on the spot when you're improvising? Those are some of the most frequently asked student questions right now in my shred guitar community over at patreon.com/BERNTH. So I think this is the perfect time to finally record a video that is addressing all of these topics. In this video I don't just want to leave you with an abstract idea or mindset on how to play and compose better solos. I want to show you an easy and very effective exercise that will make your next guitar solo much better already. So to establish a practical context, we first need a riff that we will shred over today. This is the idea that I came up with for this lesson, based around the key of C minor. So a pretty nice and simple backdrop for our guitar solos today. This riff is mostly based on the very popular power chords, but let's check it out in detail real quick. So first we have a basic C minor chord voicing, and I'm adding the perfect fifth G once again on the bottom of the chord. That always sounds great with distortion, and we get a big sounding chord right in the beginning. For this one I'm not just playing the power chord, I'm also adding the minor third E flat on top. That way I just get the basic sound and flavor of minor on the tonic chord right here instead of just playing the bland power chord. Up next I'm just quickly sliding down to the F power chord. This one just serves as a small transition to the next chord. Here I'm basically just thinking an E flat power chord, and I'm adding the perfect fifth B flat on the bottom of the chord once again. Just like with the voicing in the beginning, it makes the chord a bit bigger. And I'm also adding the ninth F on top to make it more interesting. Then I'm going to a D diminished chord to introduce a bit of dissonance. In the key of C minor I'd actually have a D half diminished chord on the second scale degree, but with metal and rock riffs it's just a bit more common to work with the diminished seventh chord right here, borrowing the note B. And after that we just have the A flat, B flat and G power chords. That leaves a lot of nice room to breathe for our guitar solo right here. And then I'm sliding down to the F power chord before the entire thing would start again. As always, you can download the detailed tabs and guitar profiles for this riff on my Patreon page, patreon.com/BERNTH. On there I'm constantly uploading the tabs, guitar profiles, practice backing tracks and video play alongs for these YouTube lessons. And I also have a VIP club on there in the form of a secret and hidden Facebook group. That way I can personally interact with the students on there. Let's talk about two very common approaches that I hear from my students when I ask them to play a guitar solo over that. The first very common approach would be thinking, well, this riff is in the key of C minor and I know this one minor pentatonic scale box, the A minor pentatonic scale, in this position on the fretboard, and I could just move it to the key of C minor and play all the licks and tricks that I learned so far in this scale box. Here's a demonstration of how that could sound like over today's riff. So that doesn't sound wrong, and I don't want to condemn the use of the minor pentatonic scale at all, but in my opinion there are a couple of issues right here and this could be done much better. First of all, an experienced player and also an experienced listener will hear that you're just working with one scale position, with that one scale box in that one position on the neck. Thinking like that will of course limit your creative possibilities quite a lot if you're just working with a confined place like that. And sometimes my students don't even want to play in this exact section of the fretboard, but they only know this one scale box that they can move around. Another thing that you could probably see visually when you were looking at this take is that I was stacking together different patterns that I memorized. So for example right here with the slides, that's one idea I might have picked up from a video or a book and then just applying it to that scale position. That lick in triplets with the pull-offs I'm playing right here is also quite popular, I think. And this kind of pentatonic style shred lick is particularly popular, and I don't think that this is the first time you ever heard it. So it kind of ends up sounding a bit predictable and boring when you just stack those building blocks together. And the final thing I have to criticize with this take is that I wasn't paying attention to the riff in the background, to the changing chords. And this is also very important concerning the second approach that I want to show you, that I hear quite often, especially from myself. When you work very hard on different techniques like fast alternate picking licks in 3-note per string scales or legato licks or sweep picking arpeggios, of course you also want to show off these skills in your guitar solos here and there. So sometimes you end up only thinking in the C minor scale all across the neck and playing as fast as complicated as possible. Here's how that could sound like. I have to admit that shredding over tracks like that is a guilty pleasure of mine, and it can sound cool if it's applied in the right way. But if you only play like that, it won't be very interesting for the listener, and it just kind of sounds like you're practicing your licks and exercises over the track. Now let's finally get to the mindset, trick and exercise I want to show you in today's video. Let's listen to one more take that immediately sounds much more interesting and musical. For me personally and to my ears, it finally sounded like I was playing with the music and not just something that's simply stacked above the music or even playing against the music. The reason for that is that I was just simply working with basic triad voicings to really accent those interesting chords correctly. Triads are insanely helpful when you're writing guitar solos and especially when you're improvising. This is something that's overlooked so often since we're just so focused on learning the next exotic scale or sound. And the most creative, interesting and musical solutions often lie hidden within the absolute fundamentals when it comes to guitar playing. Before we get to the exercise that I want you to practice from now on to improve your guitar solos, let's check out this final take step by step and figure out why it sounds so great. So for the C minor chord, I'm really just thinking in those basic C minor triad shapes. So I'm playing the root, minor third and perfect fifth, and I'm just ascending with those three different shapes, the red dots you see on the fretboard below. And as you can see with the black dots, I'm also borrowing some notes from the C minor scale to make it a bit more interesting. But the fundamental and important idea is just moving those different triad shapes across the neck, and that way I can really bring out the sound of this C minor chord because I'm playing the notes of the C minor chord in my solo. Let's check out what happens next. So once again I'm working with a super basic triad shape for the E flat power chord, and I'm adding the major 7th D right here, which makes it very interesting, and I'm also incorporating a little sweep. Up next I'm quickly playing a D diminished arpeggio shape for that D diminished chord in the background, and quickly accenting those fast moving important chords in the cadence is really awesome. You might think like quick accents and details like that aren't that important, but they make a huge difference with your guitar solo, so definitely pay attention to that. So up next for the A flat power chord, I'm once again ascending with the A flat major triad shapes, so that once again really brings out the sound of that A flat major chord we have on the scale degree. And in the end right here I once again work with major triads for the G power chord. Since it's just a power chord right here in the background, we have the option to turn the dominant chord here in the minor key into a major chord instead of a minor chord, and that always gives us a nice sense of tension and resolution. And in the end I was just playing a super quick harmonic minor scale run to also add some shredding to this take. So overall I hope you agree with me that this take sounds very interesting, melodic and musical. So let's finally discuss the exercise that I want you to practice to memorize those major and minor triads across the neck. When you work on this one, it will be easy to memorize and to utilize those minor and major triad shapes in a practical context when you're writing your next guitar solo or when you're improvising your next guitar solo take. Let's check out one repetition of the exercise real quick before we check out the details on how to practice this every day. So as you could see, we are just focusing on the G, B and E string for the moment. Since we're discussing the use of the major and minor triad shapes in a guitar solo context with this lesson, it makes sense of course to start out with the 3 highest strings on the instrument. This is also a great alternate picking exercise since we are playing 2 strokes for every single note in those triads, and we are first ascending with the minor triads and then we are switching to the major triads. And the great thing obviously is that we only have to change one note to get from the minor triads to the major triads. We have to change the minor third into a major third. The rest stays the same, the root note and the perfect fifth. So you really make sure to understand and visualize this connection correctly when you're practicing the minor and the major triads in one workout. When you're practicing this workout, I also want you to memorize the notes that you're playing with each triad shape, because you need to remember where the root note, third and fifth are located, so that you can quickly use and visualize those shapes for the correct chords when you're improvising or writing guitar solos. As a bonus for all Shred Guitar community members on Patreon, I also recorded some video play-along files once again in different tempos. By downloading these really helpful video play-along files, you can practice together with me in your next practice session, and you can quickly and systematically learn the major and minor triads all across the neck by working with those video play-alongs. Of course, and as always, I also made sure to add some scrolling tablature to those videos. That way you can easily memorize those shapes and keep a good overview over the fretboard when you're practicing. I would like to show you a pretty life-changing way of learning and visualizing scales all across the neck today. This might really change your playing forever, and it's based on a tool that you might have heard about already, the infamous circle of fifths. So in case you never heard about it before, the circle of fifths is a principle in music theory that begins with C, or the key of C major, because it has no sharps or flats. And it repeatedly moves up in steps of a perfect fifth for every key until we arrive at C major again. A perfect fifth describes the interval most commonly referred to as the power chord by guitar players. So to start out in a more practical way, you can visualize the steps of the circle of fifths like that. In case you actually missed earlier and very important music theory episodes, make sure to subscribe to this channel right now. That is the only way of staying updated and of becoming a real part of this guitar community. So when we go down the major keys, we move up a perfect fifth each time. For example, from C to G, that's a perfect fifth. Then from G to D, that is another perfect fifth, and so on. And as you can see, when we're going down these major keys relative minor keys, we're also moving up in perfect fifths. So from A to E to B, and so on. We won't go into detail about using this really helpful tool for songwriting, cadences, and so on, since I want to move to the really cool exercise I want to show you today as fast as possible. Today we are only interested in one thing, the changing accidentals for each key. As we said in the beginning, we start out with the key of C major, or its relative minor key A minor, because they have no sharps or flats in them. In C major, we have the notes C, D, E, F, G, A, and B. And in A minor, we have the notes A, B, C, D, E, F, and G. Now here's where it starts to get really interesting. The circle of fifths arranges the keys in a sequence of moving up through the sharp keys. For example, C major, as we discussed, has no sharps, G major has one sharp, F sharp, and so on. It then works down the flat keys from G flat major with 6 flats down through F major, 1 flat to C major again. And that is the exact point where I had my light bulb moment at the conservatory. I remember asking myself, wait, so G major has the same notes as C major with just one exception, F sharp? And I already know the C major scale all across the neck, so when I only change this one note, when I change F to F sharp, I get a completely new scale. This is a really powerful thought, because you start to move away from visualizing scale boxes across the neck, like really just seeing the dots where you have to press down on the fretboard, and you start to get a deeper understanding of the connection and theory of all these scales. I will show you an extremely powerful exercise that makes all of this much more practical very soon. For now, let's just check out a basic example, a lick in C major. Now let's say I'd like to work with this exact idea in the key of G major, because there's a key change coming up in the song. As guitarists, we are guilty of constantly thinking in scale boxes, so most of us would probably move this idea up or down to fit the right scale box for the right key. Often we move licks and ideas up or down the fretboard to certain positions that we don't actually want to play in, simply because we can think of a fitting arpeggio shape or a scale box that has the root note in this particular area. So this new kind of knowledge that we just discussed comes in very handy right now. Let's see what happens when we just change F to F sharp to fit the new key. So as you could see, I really just had to change one note, and I didn't even think about any complicated scale diagrams or scale boxes and all of that. This is just a basic example, of course, but think about the amazing possibilities you get from switching between different keys in that kind of fluid way. Especially when you're improvising, you will sound much less predictable and like you're just moving patterns around to fit different chords and keys. But of course, this way of thinking requires some fretboard visualization skills. So if you can't really visualize the notes on your fretboard yet, I really recommend working with different exercises we discussed so far, like the octave triangle, for example. Now it's finally time for the exercise I want to show you. So if you want to familiarize yourself with this really powerful system, I recommend the following approach. For this one, we're just working with a very small scale position for C major. So we're playing the notes C, D, E, F, G, A, and B, just in this one octave. And then we start to go through the circle of fifths, always just changing one more note. So for the next key, G major, we have to change F to F sharp, but we are still starting with C as the first note so that the pattern remains the same. So for the second repetition of the exercise, you are playing C, D, E, F sharp, G, A, and B. And then you just keep moving through the entire circle of fifths. Let's check out how the full exercise looks and sounds like. As always, you can download the tabs, guitar profiles, and a really helpful backing track for this exercise on patreon.com/BERNTH. So as you could see, I was only changing one note in this small scale fragment as I was moving through all the keys in the circle of fifths. And this is a great and really eye-opening way of understanding the relationship of all these major and their relative minor keys. And I really hope that I could help and that this is a big game changer for you as well. My biggest goal with this video is breaking down the concept and system of the modes to the smallest possible level. So instead of focusing on all 7 modes right away, we will only work on 2 of them today. I would dare to say that those are also the 2 most common scales you will come across if you're into rock, metal and shred guitar playing. So instead of overwhelming you with a lot of complex information today, I really just want you to understand the connection between those 2 scales we're looking at today. And once you completely get that connection and understand it in a musical way, the rest of the modes will open up for you easily. So let's begin right away. First of all, we can divide the modes into 2 different groups, the modes in major and the modes in minor. And here's what's really exciting and helpful. We can also go one step further and define one fundamental scale for major and minor. What I mean by that is actually already the most important piece of information I want you to remember today. You mostly only have to change one note in those fundamental major and minor modes to get all the other modes, with the exception of the least popular mode that's called Locrian. I know that almost sounds too good to be true, and when I discovered this connection between all the most popular modes, they finally made sense to me. But let's make this concept even smaller and easier for today and only focus on 2 minor modes. We will focus on a direct comparison of Aeolian, the fundamental minor mode, and Phrygian, a small variation of that sound. The great news is that you might already be able to play the Aeolian scale all across the neck because it's just another name for the natural minor scale. So those 2 fundamental modes I just talked about in major and minor, Ionian and Aeolian, are actually just the natural major and the natural minor scale. And the way that I mostly remember learning the modes when I was studying guitar at the conservatory was essentially just learning one mode all across the neck every single week. And it's quite easy for a teacher to give you a good or a bad grade for that, since it's quite easy to measure in terms of did you put your fingers on the wrong or on the right frets. But by just learning them mechanically like that, almost like an exercise, I basically got a good grade without actually knowing what I'm doing and what kind of notes I'm playing and how to use all that in a practical context. So I can really recommend not starting to think in those scale boxes right away. First, I would visualize the scale in just one octave and really think about the notes and the intervals that I'm playing. Let's work in the key of E minor today. So one E you might be able to locate easily already, aside from the lower open E string, of course, is the E we have right here on the 7th fret on the A string. So let's make that one our root note, the lowest note for our scale. When I'm playing all notes of the E minor scale in this location with E on the 7th fret on the A string as my lowest note, I get the following result: E, F sharp, G, A, B, C, D, and up to E once again, to the octave. So instead of immediately turning the full scale box into a technique exercise or studying the scale all across the fretboard without knowing the notes that you're playing, I really recommend just playing this fragment of the scale, all the notes up until the octave, and to really remember the notes that you're playing, the whole steps and the half steps in the scale, and the intervals. Because once you really remember and understand this small scale phrase, you can move it with the octave trick we discussed on the channel. Because I have E right here, I can easily visualize the scale. in this position, but I also have E right here. So I can play the exact same notes in a different octave. I have E right here, but I'm missing the next string, so I can only play it up until here with the same pattern. Then of course I have E right here on the 12th fret on the low E string. So the same scale phrase right here on the 14th fret of the D string. Then up here on the 17th fret on the B string, and so on. So by memorizing this small fragment and thinking in octaves, I can basically play the entire scale across the neck already. But the real and exciting benefit from thinking like that becomes very clear as soon as you start working with the modes. So let's check out the notes of the E Phrygian mode right now. So let's start again with E right here on the 7th fret on the A string, and the notes of the E Phrygian scale are E, F, G, A, B, C, D, and then here we are at E once again. Now if you paid close attention right here, you notice that there's just one note that is different from the natural minor scale. Instead of playing F sharp on the 9th fret on the A string, that would be the major second in the natural minor scale, we are playing F on the 8th fret on the A string, and that's the characteristic minor second interval of the Phrygian scale. So this is what really defines that Phrygian sound. So we get that really cool, dark and kind of mysterious sound that you can hear in tons of metal riffs. Especially in comparison to the more tame sound of the major second in the natural minor scale. That doesn't really have that classic metal riff sound. So that brings us to the next very important point, when to actually use the natural minor scale and when to use the Phrygian scale. So for the first example, and I really hope that won't hurt your ears too much, I'm playing the E Phrygian scale over the riff in E natural minor. So as you can hear, that doesn't really work out too well whenever I'm playing F, the characteristic note of the E Phrygian scale that really clashes with F sharp in the riff. And with that I want to show you, of course, that the riff and the chords in the background are mostly responsible for your scale choices, and you can't just pick Phrygian because you really like the sound. You also have to pay attention to the musical environment and the composition you're playing over. Let's do the opposite now and play the natural minor scale over the Phrygian riff. As you can hear, that unsurprisingly sounds equally painful, so it also doesn't work the other way around, and the natural minor scale isn't some kind of safe zone that you can apply to all kinds of riffs. I really want you to pay attention to the notes in the riffs from now on to make the best melodic choices. And for the last and very surprising example, I will play the correct scale, the Phrygian scale, over the Phrygian riff, but I will constantly accent that characteristic note F in my improvised take. So from a music theory standpoint, I'm doing nothing wrong. Let's see if it also sounds like that. So that also sounds pretty weird because F, that minor second in the scale, is a really dissonant note. So this is a note in the scale similar to the minor sixth that you can use to add a lot of tension to your licks and that kind of dark color. It would be the minor second right here, F, and the minor sixth, C. So not really the most melodic notes in the world. So although those are the right notes, from a music theory standpoint, you have to be very careful with using them, and you will never be able to do that and actually sound good with the scales that you're using when you just learn where to put your fingers on the fretboard. To quickly summarize today's video, I would personally start out by learning either the natural minor or natural major scale, both in the best case, just in one octave on the fretboard, really memorizing the notes that you are playing, the whole tone, half tone structure, and the intervals. And then you know all 7 notes of either the fundamental major or minor mode that you need to build all those other modes. And as we discussed, you mostly just have to change one note to get all those other interesting modes, with the exception of Locrian, which is also the least popular mode. For today's lesson, we chose to work with Phrygian, since it's a very common metal and rock scale. And for that one, we just had to change the major second of natural minor or Aeolian to a minor second to get Phrygian. Instead of just moving boxes around the fretboard and really not thinking about the notes that you are playing, you will be able to improvise, compose, play and understand much more interesting material that way. You will get a much better understanding of which scale you should use in which practical context. And of course, maybe that's the most important aspect, you will learn a lot of scales really fast because you just have to change minor details in them. So today I will show you my absolute favorite, really cool, majestic and atmospherical chord voicings. These chords will really spice up your playing and songwriting, and they're easier than you might think. So most of the time when we think about spicing up our chords or arrangement or learning new exciting chords, we think about adding more notes to the chord voicings in the form of tensions, making them more complex. We also think about changing the chords in the arrangement or composition completely, borrowing different notes and chords from different keys or working with advanced theory concepts. And that can all be quite intimidating at the beginning, especially if you didn't work on a lot of music theory yet and come across pictures like that on the internet. I hope that didn't cause you too much internal stress. This is not what we are working on today. Today I will show you a super easy and amazing sounding concept that you can apply to all the chords that you already learned. We will not make the chords extremely complicated and hard to understand by adding tons of different notes and tensions to them, and you also need close to zero music theory knowledge to apply this correctly. To make this easier to understand, more fun and also more practical, I'd like to work with a super basic cadence in the key of A minor today. So this is how the foundation for today sounds like. That sounds pretty boring if you ask me. For this super basic example, I was playing an A minor chord, then I was switching to a G major chord, then I was playing a C major chord, and then back to the G major chord. I think we all know a couple of songs that feature this cadence or a cadence very similar to that. Today's challenge is spicing this exact cadence up without making it too complicated. Once again, we'll work with triads, but today's trick is something really amazing that we never discussed on this channel before. So for the major chords in this cadence, we are playing the root, major third and perfect fifth, and for the minor chord in this cadence we are playing the root, minor third and perfect fifth. The most common way that doesn't sound too interesting yet, that I see with my students when they are working with triads, is always placing the root on the bottom, followed by the third and the fifth. So for example, playing the root A on the 5th fret on the low E string, the minor third C on the 3rd fret of the A string, and the perfect fifth E on the 2nd fret on the D string. That would be the classic A minor triad. Here's how it sounds like when I work with these basic triads for this cadence. Okay, so that might even sound more boring. So where am I going with this? There are two basic tricks that you can apply to get an amazing sound right here. First of all, don't always use the root note as the lowest note in the voicing, use different inversions. The second and even more important trick is that we will spread out the notes on the fretboard a bit more to get the amazing and unique sound of the open triads. To show you how extremely powerful that system is, I recorded another practical demonstration for today. In that one you will exactly hear the difference between the first basic arrangement and the open triads. As always, you can download the tabs, guitar profiles and chord sheets for this lesson on patreon.com/BERNTH. Once you join my shred guitar community over there, you can download the tabs, guitar profiles, practice backing tracks and much more for every single YouTube lesson that I published so far. So let's take a closer look at what I exactly changed to get this really cool sound. As soon as you understand this really easy theory trick, you will be able to apply this to your own music after watching today's video until the end. Let's start with the voicing I used for A minor. So as you know, we have three notes in the basic A minor voicing. We have A, the root note, C, the minor third, and E, the perfect fifth. And the most common way these notes are arranged on the fretboard when we want an A minor chord is like that. I'm sure you're familiar with that shape. We're playing A, the open A string, E, A once again, C, and E once again with the open high E string. And like I showed you a bit earlier, this is the basic A minor triad voicing, where I'm just playing root, minor third, perfect fifth. And aside from playing the minor third right here on the 3rd fret on the A string, I'm just moving from the root to the perfect fifth right away. And then I'm adding the minor third right here on the 5th fret on the G string. So this voicing sounds much more interesting, but I'm not changing anything about the notes. I'm still just playing the root, perfect fifth, and the minor third on top with that one. So by just changing the order of the notes and making the intervals bigger in size, I get a much more interesting sound. Let's check out the G major shape next. So in the G major chord I can find 3 notes: G, the root, B, the major third, and D, the perfect fifth. So the standard triad in this position would look like that: root, major third, perfect fifth. But instead of that, I'm starting out with the major third B as my lowest note on the 7th fret on the E string. Then I'm playing the root note G on the 5th fret on the D string, and then the perfect fifth D. So a really cool sound once again. Up next I have to come up with a more interesting voicing for the C major chord. Here's what I chose for that. So once again I'm using my ring finger for C, the root note, the index finger for G, the perfect fifth, and my pinky finger for E, the major third. And once again, a really cool sound. And then I was using another really easy trick that makes the new version much more interesting. The old cadence, in case you remember the demonstration, was moving back to the same shape for the G major chord. Since we have so many different options and inversions with these triads, we also want to make sure not to use the same ones all the time. When we look at the lowest notes of the new arrangement, we also have a really nice ascending movement. So of course I could just go back down to G like that. But it kind of sounds predictable and repetitive that way, and it would be a shame to break up that ascending movement. So as another cool variation for the G major chord, I could start with the perfect fifth as my bass note, major third, and root note on top of the voicing. That also sounds really nice. That sounds really nice and quite atmospherical, much better than the original version. I hope you agree with me right here. And the very last option you have is also adding some more interesting notes. That's what I did with the practical demonstration. So by just adding different notes of the scale to the open triads to create some intervals that I like, that sound even more interesting, I could get a sound like that, for example. So for this A minor shape, I was adding D on top on the 3rd fret on the B string. Here it gets a bit difficult with the stretching, so you can also move this chord up to practice this shape. For the first G major open triad I was just adding E right here on the 5th fret on the B string, so that one's a bit easier. For C major right here I wanted to add the major 7th B here on top on the 7th fret on the high E string, so that one's a bit tricky once again. And then for the final G major voicing I was just moving the root note down a half step to get this kind of major 7th sound with this open triad, so that's a pretty cool ending, I think. But you don't have to extend these shapes and triads at all. To me those basic open triads already sound really amazing. We will check out the most important and most powerful exercise we have looked at on this channel so far concerning fretboard visualization, improvisation and writing and arranging guitar solos in general. So make sure to smash the like button if you're as excited about this as I am. Let's not waste any more time and start right away. Our foundation for today is a super easy riff in B flat minor. Let's have a listen. So for this one I was just playing ascending single notes in the key of B flat minor. B flat on the 1st fret of the A string, C on the 3rd fret, D flat on the 4th fret, and E flat on the 6th fret. And I was just playing palm muted 16th notes to accent the double bass drumming accordingly. So far so good, so that is the basic foundation that we will play over today. So the most common cliche, especially when it comes to rock and metal music, would be thinking, well, those are the first 4 notes of the B flat minor scale. So I will just use this scale in 1 or 2 positions and work with some of my favorite shred licks at the moment. Here's how that could sound like. So that doesn't sound too bad, but it's also not that interesting. The most important takeaway right here, right from the beginning, is not just seeing those single notes. You want to think about each chord that you would actually play on these scale degrees. So when we take a quick look at the chords in the key of B flat minor, we see that we have the B flat minor chord on the first scale degree, of course. We have the C diminished chord on the second scale degree, which is a really interesting and dissonant sound right away. So we really want to make sure to accent that in our improvised solo. We have the D flat major chord on the third scale degree and the E flat minor chord on the fourth scale degree. So once again, instead of just seeing those single notes in the riff, B flat, C, D flat and E flat, I'm actually thinking about what kind of chords that would be in this specific key if those were my root notes. In order to do that, I would just add the third and fifth to each root note, only working with the notes that I can find in this scale. So once again, for today's basic riff, I would end up with the chords B flat minor, C diminished, D flat major and E flat minor. So right away, I don't just want to limit myself to thinking in the B flat minor scale when I'm improvising over this riff. I want to play some really cool arpeggios over all those single notes. That way, by thinking in chords and arpeggios right here, I can bring out this really cool ascending sound of this cadence that you don't really hear with the riffs, since those are just single notes. But how do you do that without spending tons of hours learning different minor, major, augmented and diminished arpeggio shapes all across the neck? Here's the exercise that I want you to practice concerning that. This one will hopefully open your eyes to see how easy this actually is. As always, you can download the tabs, guitar profiles and practice backing tracks for this exercise and for all of my YouTube lessons on patreon.com/BERNTH. That is also the place where you can get some personal feedback, coaching and practice plan advice from me in case you need further assistance with certain exercises. So let's check out what this exercise is about in detail and why it is so important and powerful. So I'm seeing the single notes of the riff as the root notes of the arpeggios, and I started out with playing triad arpeggios. So for the B flat minor chord, I want to play a B flat minor arpeggio. For the C diminished chord, I want to play a C diminished arpeggio, and so on. So to get started, I was just visualizing the root notes of the chords B flat, C, D flat and E flat, and I was switching to playing B flat on the 6th fret on the low E string instead of the 1st fret on the A string, since that gives me more options concerning the fingering. And after that, I was simply adding the thirds and the fifths to those roots, the minor third and the perfect fifth for the minor arpeggios, the major third and perfect fifth for the major arpeggio, and the minor third and the flattened fifth for the diminished arpeggio. So I was playing the root, minor third, perfect fifth for the B flat minor chord, root, minor third, flattened or diminished fifth for the C diminished chord, root, major third, perfect fifth for the D flat major chord, and root, minor third, perfect fifth for the E flat minor chord. So by just doing this simple thing, I can immediately hear the sound of the cadence because I'm adding the thirds and the fifths to those roots that I'm hearing in the riff. So that already sounds nice and melodic, but of course we want to take this to the next level now. For the next level, I don't have to change anything about the notes that I just played, I just have to add another note. The obvious choice is going for 7th arpeggios now. So I'm adding a minor 7th to the minor arpeggios, a major 7th to the major arpeggio, and a minor 7th to the minor 7 flat 5 or half diminished arpeggio. So this is the basic minor triad arpeggio for the B flat minor chord, root, minor third, perfect fifth. And to get the minor 7th arpeggio, I'm just adding the minor 7th, root, minor 3rd, perfect 5th, minor 7th. Then I do the same thing for the C minor 7 flat 5 chord. Here I'm playing root, minor 3rd, the flattened or diminished 5th, and the minor 7th on top. Then I'm moving to the D flat major 7 chord, root, major 3rd, perfect 5th, major 7th. And then I'm using the familiar shape, the one that we started out with for the E flat minor chord, root, minor 3rd, perfect 5th, and the minor 7th on top. So the 7th arpeggios immediately sound more interesting than the triad arpeggios. And the final level of this exercise is your biggest takeaway for today. This is where things get really interesting. Instead of just memorizing where to put your fingers when you're learning those big arpeggio shapes that you need for sweep picking, for example, you can just move these 7th arpeggios that you already learned to the next octave. So I'm really just repeating the same notes, the same formula in the next octave, playing the root, 3rd, 5th and 7th. And by doing that, I immediately get a really cool big shape that I can potentially extend across the entire fretboard if I want to. And by visualizing arpeggios that way, I also remember which notes I'm playing, and that is very important. So for the B flat minor 7th arpeggio, I'm just playing the root, minor 3rd, perfect 5th, and minor 7th. And then I'm just thinking in octaves. So my next B flat would be right here. And then I'm just doing the exact same thing. I'm playing the root, minor 3rd, perfect 5th, and the minor 7th. So this is really easy to memorize and to visualize across the neck. This big arpeggio shape is simply just starting over on the D string. Root, minor 3rd, perfect 5th, minor 7th, root, minor 3rd, perfect 5th, minor 7th. So when you download the tabs, get the profiles and practice backing tracks on Patreon that I made specially for you, you will just start out by playing the basic triad arpeggio for each chord in the cadence. Then you will add the 7th to each shape, and then you will just repeat the shape in the next octave. And when you just do that for 5 to 10 minutes every single day in your practice routine for different cadences, you will see the entire fretboard in a completely new way, and this will make improvising much, much easier. Let's talk about guitar solos. I want to show you 6 easy tricks that will greatly improve your lead guitar playing. Working with this simple checklist will bring you awesome results immediately. I want to play a guitar solo for you right away. This is the first guitar solo from the first song of my first album, Elevation. As always, you can download the tabs, guitar profiles and backing tracks of this solo on patreon.com/BERNTH in case you want to learn it. I highly suggest it. Trick number 1 is called dynamics. I'm aiming for a balance of high adrenaline shredding and melodic hooks with my guitar solos, and I think this take serves as a pretty good example for that. I'm working with the E Phrygian dominant scale right here that has a really cool exotic sound to it, and what's interesting about the phrasing is the inclusion of 2 quick breaks after the first 2 parts. As you can see, I'm placing these quick breaks after the first melody and after the first scale run. This leaves a bit of room for the solo to breathe, and I really like how those very different parts mirror each other this way. I don't want to impress you with a super fast, mindless run that lasts for over 30 seconds right away. I want to build some tension and suspense first to hopefully hook you for the entire duration of the song. The second trick is about intervals and overlapping notes. This is something I'd love to hear more often out there in the rock and metal guitar world. We often only think in single notes when it comes to guitar solos, like playing scales or arpeggios with sweep picking. But a really easy way of spicing up your guitar solos immediately is the inclusion of overlapping notes, or intervals in other words. This opens a completely new door when it comes to unique phrasing and lick ideas. Please listen to the first measures of the guitar solo once again with me and pay close attention to all the intervals I included in there aside from the single notes. So within the first measures, I'm already playing a crazy sounding minor second interval. So that sounds really crazy. And then I move up to a major third and a perfect fourth. So here's the entire phrase. And a bit later, I'm working with the open high E string to play a unison interval. A major third if I see E as the root note. And then a minor seventh. So the full phrase sounds like that. These very interesting sounds really tie the melodies and the shredding together, and a lot of players, including myself, are guilty of not doing this all too much. So please make sure not to just think in single notes and scale boxes when you're playing guitar solos or when you're improvising. As an awesome exercise, you can just visualize a scale position you remember and only work with intervals in your next improvisation sessions. Depending on the situation, of course, this can sound much more interesting than common phrasing like that. I think we all heard that somewhere before. Let's talk about fast scale runs and shredding. I personally love the sound of that, of course, but you do have to be a bit careful so that you don't sound like you're practicing your scales over the track. So one of my personal biggest goals is getting a bit more creative with these runs. The first one I played is actually a pretty good example, instead of playing something like that. So really just ascending in the scale, just playing it up. I worked with this pattern that sounds a bit more interesting. I think this sounds a bit more fresh and exciting. I'm also doing something similar with the final phrase. This time it's just a small detail. Instead of just descending, I play a shorter phrase and then I just repeat it. Those are two really awesome alternate picking exercises in case you're currently looking for some workouts. Of course, those licks go by very fast, but I think you have a real chance to sound unique and to stand out if you focus on the details like that. This trick requires a bit of theory knowledge. If you're new to music theory or if you want to improve your knowledge when it comes to that, make sure to subscribe to this channel right now. Nothing has changed. Still around 70% of you guys and girls are not part of our awesome YouTube community yet. And you keep missing tons of tips that will really help you out with guitar technique and theory. So one concept I can really recommend is harmonizing your melodies. You can actually hear some harmonies right at the beginning of the guitar solo in the studio track. But I'd like to talk about the diminished arpeggios I'm playing a bit later. Harmonizing them is actually really easy and it will get you that classic evil and very suspenseful sound. As you might know, you can move diminished arpeggio shapes and chord shapes symmetrically across the neck. If you move a diminished shape up or down a minor third, you always end up with the same notes in a different order. So diminished licks are perfectly easy to harmonize. Let's listen to how cool this harmonized sweep picking arpeggio part sounds. So all I did to harmonize this diminished arpeggio part was moving this exact shape up. So I just took this exact shape and moved it up a minor third. This results in those easy and really cool sounding harmonies. That also goes for all kinds of other melodies, of course. If you can visualize the scale around the notes that you play, you can just experiment with harmonizing your melody by playing thirds or fifths, or maybe fourths or sixths for a more fusion-like sound. Let's check out one of my favorite concepts now, dissonance and color. Dissonant sounds are an acquired taste, of course, but at one point I absolutely fell in love with them. So as you might know by now, I really love the sound of minor seconds. But I always had issues with including them in my solos without sounding too strange or out of place completely. An easy solution is just finding those dissonant sounds in the scale shapes that you're working with. If those two notes are actually part of your harmonic context, you can always try to go for them. It won't work every time, but your chances are much better than with just randomly trying to sound dissonant or outside on purpose. Another example is the diminished section we just looked at.
The notes of these diminished arpeggios are actually all part of the scale, and that's what makes them work. So my suggestion is experimenting freely with dissonant intervals and augmented or diminished sounds in your practice routine. And if your ears develop a taste for them, make sure to include them in your guitar solos. The last and probably most important topic is improvisation. I did not come up with this solo by sitting down with pen and paper and writing down every single note and measure after measure. I initially just improvised over this riff for many hours, and I also recorded a lot of these takes in Cubase. I was always saving ideas that I liked, and I was building the solo part by part this way. Any kind of recording software is extremely helpful when it comes to that. I can always just loop the riff in Cubase and play hundreds of takes, and then I can just put the guitar down for a while and revisit all of these takes. And that way I can slowly build the full guitar solo. So I really like combining improvisation, meaning coming up with spontaneous ideas and phrases on the spot, with thought out structures for the solo and tension curves that keep things interesting.